Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Before we get started, I want to invite you to come to Unwind, a free drop-in practice session that I'm leading each week on Zoom. It lasts about 30 minutes and just long enough, hopefully, to fit between all your other tasks and to-dos. Each week, I give a brief science-backed tip to help with stress management or well-being enhancement. Then we spend about 15 minutes in a guided relaxation, meditation, or contemplation practice. Lastly, we end with a few minutes for discussion and personal connection. I encourage people to make the session work for themselves, so if you prefer to call in or keep your camera off, that is just fine. You can get more details and sign up to get the Zoom link and call-in information at drkateking.com/unwind. Hope to see you there. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Kate King.
And I'm Alex Gökçe. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Charles Lee Joseph about meditation, parallels between Buddhism and Christianity, and contemplating end of life. We also explore engaged Buddhism, racial justice, and practical applications of meditation to everyday life.
Charles Lee Joseph, MD, is a physician practicing in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he lives with his wife and children. You can learn more, get this episode's show notes, and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, Charles Lee. Thanks so much for joining us today. And maybe we'll get started by just having you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Charles Lee Joseph, and I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm a physician, a father, and a husband. Have just really deepened my practice of mindfulness and meditation during this pandemic. It really has given me an opportunity to practice a lot more and be exposed to a lot more teachings.
Maybe you could tell us, how did you encounter these teachings?
Really from a place of suffering. About a couple of years ago, I was in a job that I didn't like, working way too much. I had no time for family, no time for relationship. I was very angry. I was very sad. I was spent. And I essentially had a nervous breakdown, stopped working. And for the first time in my life, I think I asked for help. I asked everybody for help because this is not something I could hide. I was extremely stressed. So I asked the doctor for help. I asked my psychiatrist for help. Well, I found a psychiatrist. I started going back to church. I picked up books on self-help, on how to live. And so that's how I came to these teachings. I think one of the first books I read was actually given to me by my wife. It was a book by Tara Brach. And the titles of all of her books all jumbled together for me. Her stories were so poignant for me. They seemed so real. And then at the end of each chapter, so I think she had a little bit of a Buddhist teaching towards the end, maybe a paragraph or two. And I was like, that was before the pandemic. And so I began to sit at, we have an insight meditation center here in Albuquerque.
Nice.
We have a center as well. And so I began to sit there when I could, which was maybe once a week. I had to drive there. I had to, it had to be a day where my kids were relatively taken care of. So yeah, that's how I started.
I appreciate your honesty in saying you came to it from suffering. And when I think about it, that's true for me too.
Yeah, and I was thinking as you were talking also that I remember, having this sort of down and out place and then, hitting that first noble truth about life being characterized by suffering, or all the different ways it's translated, and just being like, thank you. Like, right. Like that is exactly what I'm going through. It just felt very validating for me. I know for other people, they sort of feel like that first noble truth is a little bit like the bad news. But for me, it felt like the good news. Like I'm not alone. Like this is what everyone goes through. Like, struggle and suffer is part of life.
I also notice, for instance, there's a vulnerability also, as well as honesty, in saying that those qualities are qualities that are shown by people who progress on this path a lot. You've started out, were you raised Episcopalian? Is that what you had said?
Yeah. So my parents are from the Caribbean. My mom's Jamaican, the Anglican church influence there. So, and I was raised in Connecticut, so the Northeast. So, there's a church on every block. I was raised in the Episcopal church and, regularly attended. It was what I did on Sundays. And it wasn't, it was a wonderful church.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It was not dogmatic. I mean, as liberal as a place as I could find. And even I remember the Sunday school teachings being explicitly told that, these are stories of the Bible. These are meant to be lessons. These might not have said like, this isn't literally actually true, but they didn't, that's what they said, in between the lines was that these stories of Jesus as lessons on how to live. Don't believe that, it's like, I think John Kabat-Zinn said something like this, like, take it seriously, but not literally.
They are true in a different sense.
Yes. So I had a grounding, I think, in spiritual upbringing. I didn't really appreciate it. I definitely, in my late teens and college years, I just, was cynical and very science-minded and thought, I just left. I left the church as the church isn't for me. It was really a time thing. I guess I just wanted to do other things with my Sunday mornings.
Do you see a continuity between the Episcopal tradition or what you experienced within that, and then now with your experience with the Dharma, your spiritual journey?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think even though I didn't appreciate it as a young person, I certainly had the foundation to dip into the teachings, to understand, just a lot of the spiritual themes. And I see spirituality or religion, a lot of them are trying to say the same thing. I mean, there are these stories about, people in the Bible kind of asking for help. A lot of the concepts in Eastern religions are fundamentally the same. This idea of not self, of not separating, oneself, community, society, the planet. This is what I think at base a lot of these religions are about, because it's about people talking about practicing with suffering. I mean, I'm a pretty privileged first world adult who I don't think I'm going to go and cut myself and die of an infection.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a foundation of basic wellness that so many of us take for granted. I mean, there's absolutely connections, as we're starting to articulate here, between many religious traditions. And I'm wondering if you see more specific connections or overlaps in practices, or, what makes you decide to meditate on one day versus pray or go to church or go to the shrine room at a meditation center?
On a great day, I would do both. In fact, one of my, part of my introduction to meditation was the church that I currently go to here in Albuquerque, the St. Mark's Episcopal Church. After the service and after coffee hour, we had a little sangha, essentially. About 5 or 6 of us met for an hour. We would sit in silence for about 20 minutes, and we would talk. Afterwards, we were doing a lot of stuff around nonviolent communication in terms of partnerships. Many of us were around the same age, in our 40s, and married, with or without children. And before then, I didn't even know the term sangha. I wasn't as facile with these terms. So I didn't really realize what it was, but it was a beautiful thing. But one of the deep connections that I have seen is really the story that is told. Ultimately, I have a recognition that my life is a story. I can't escape it. I can sometimes thin the self. I can sometimes touch that emptiness, that spaciousness that maybe very highly developed meditators can get to. But ultimately, my life is a story. May I move through this conventional life. I can't be, this emptiness, nothingness, like that, while true, doesn't feed my children, doesn't send them to school, is not onward going for me. So I used to tell myself a pretty depressing story, a failure, a story of what ifs, a story of, but when I look back at kind of the foundation stories, myths, parables of religions, there's that hero archetype of, if it's Jesus, being born poor in a manger, barely counted, and then becoming a beloved teacher, but then getting crucified and martyred, but then coming back, resurrecting. And whether or not there was a historical Jesus, whether or not that person is also the mythical Jesus, who knows? But the story is one of, I can become incarnate in this vehicle, in this body, and I can do great things. They can go unrecognized by society. Society can kill me. I can still come back. The Buddha grows up in opulence, very sheltered childhood, a childhood that I probably have provided for my children. I shelter from pain. I don't want them to experience the vicissitudes of life. But then he gets curious. He's like, as any teenager, or I think he was 9 at the time, person in their 20s would get. It's like, I wonder what's out there. Because I think he already felt like, is this it? Is this all that there is to life? And so he goes out into the real world and is shocked. He sees illness. He sees death. He sees old age. But then he sees a sage. He sees an ascetic or a mystic. He sees maybe the level of comfort that person may have. And so he embarks on his own journey to come to an understanding. So I can now tell the story of my life maybe more towards that salvation framework. So the voice in my head has definitely changed. Its tone has changed.
Is there a specific practice or practices you attribute that shift to in particular?
I would say, firstly, loving kindness practice. I remember learning loving kindness practice. It must have been a couple of months into my formal sitting practice. I think the very first sits I did, I just went and sat in silence. At Albuquerque Meditation Center, it was a silent sit that started at 5:45 in the morning, and they rang a bell, I think, every 30 minutes. And some people sat for 30 minutes, some people an hour. There was one yogi who sat for 2 hours. I don't know how. And then I sat some Shambhala sits there was chanting and a little bit of guidance, but none of the Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, Joseph Goldstein kind of type. About 2 months in, I think I discovered Insight Meditation Center in Redwood City. So that's Gil Fronsdal's. I believe he's the director or the founder of that center. And there is a woman named Nikki Mirgafori. And she and some others host something called Happy Hour. And it has it's a meditation happy hour, so
because that sounds like a double meaning.
Yeah, so it's non-alcoholic, and it's meta practice. It's almost every night, every weeknight.
Nice.
An hour of meta practice, and this was still before COVID, so this was available through podcast and through their website. Mm-hmm. And so I would just listen to the recordings because they would have these live at their center. People would come in and they'd sit, and then they would share a little bit towards the end. And I did that for a couple of weeks straight, kind of Monday through Friday. And I just became a nicer person to myself and to others. I gave myself a break. I became much nicer to my kids. I gave them a break. I became nicer to my wife, nicer to my parents. I mean, I think so much of it was getting the reflection, the mirroring from others, being around and with others who are doing the same. It was like, rather than kind of consuming the news and doom scrolling and just seeing what's wrong with everything. It kind of turned, I realized it's not my nature, but I had become a person who was always commenting on what was wrong with something. And that's been professionally advantageous as a physician in terms of diagnosing disease, but it's not always so helpful in, talking to your kids.
Right. Those skills we cultivate professionally, I think we end up overusing in other ways at other places. It seems like it's so nice to hear that people are able to access loving kindness practice as a way in to the Dharma, because I feel like when I first started, I don't know, it just was less available somehow than it is now. There's been a shift somehow in the culture over the years where, like now you can drop into a meta session, whereas before it felt like that almost was like an advanced practice. You had to just like sit and be with your miserable mind for a certain amount of time before you were even given access to those things. But that's shifted in recent years, which is delightful because that warmth and that care that you cultivate, first of all, you see benefit, as you're saying, like you just feel like a nicer person. You're nicer to yourself. Just makes a big difference. And that sort of whets the appetite to want to study more and explore more.
What goes off in my head, I guess, is try it and see for yourself. The term in Buddha and in Pali or Sanskrit is ehipassiko. That would be my suggestion to anybody, because yes, my first experiences with meditation were certainly not pleasant. I mean, I sat down, I closed my eyes, and my mind was just like just screaming screaming at itself, just like, oh my gosh. And at least for me, it was like coming home. It was like, oh, that makes sense. And so my practice is, again, I'm so grateful that it's developed. I'm at a point of, really beginning to grapple with emptiness, non-self, but without impermanence, but without this aversion, and I'm still able to be caring, loving, and kind to the people around me, but also am beginning to get interested in sort of more of these cosmic dimensions of practice.
I'm just trying to remember. I was listening to something recently and I can't remember what it was now. Oh, it was this great book called The Heart Attack Sutra. And they were talking about emptiness, different translations of emptiness, I think. Just this, I sort of had this idea, as you're saying, like not in a conceptual sort of way, but just sort of starting to grapple with what that means and how it feels to relate to that. And some of the other words that they were using as they were describing it was like spaciousness or possibility, like open possibility. Because when I hear emptiness, it can sound very like sort of nihilistic or kind of like harsh or cold or something. But when I think about it as space and possibility and like gap kind of, then it feels sort of like, ooh, that feels like somehow more relatable. I think emptiness maybe isn't the best translation, but I'm no translator. So I'm inclined, if you have any insights on this, Charles, I know you said you're a physician. How is that as a teacher when it comes to relating with suffering and sickness, old age and death? Have you noticed how you relate to your work?
Yeah, so I don't, interestingly enough, I don't relate to my work much differently than I did before. Western education for physicians, it's brutal, but it does create, I think, in a large part, good physicians. I think at the expense of maybe the other parts of their life. So like I heard on one of your episodes about being able to give compassion and care to others a lot easier than yourself. That is part of the hidden curriculum in medicine, is to really beat yourself up as the physician in order to take care of the needs of your patients.
And is there even a status in that? Like the more self-sacrificing you can be, the better, kind of. Yeah.
Yes, I think there is I don't know if it's a martyr complex or something like that, but that is inculcated. And when I say hidden curriculum, meaning nobody writes that on a PowerPoint or something, but it's what you see the older medical students, residents, physicians do and get rewarded for. And so one kind of follows in line.
Yeah.
But I would say, in terms of understanding suffering, understanding birth, old age, illness, death, I've had the privilege of being there innumerable times, whether that's the birth of children, even though I'm not an obstetrician, but in medical school, you do that rotation. And so I believe I was there, or one of the first persons that a human being saw, maybe 10 or 15 times. And when you really stop and think about that, how beautiful. And then really my biggest teacher has probably been, and I work in a nursing home, so I work with a lot of elderly patients, and to be able to talk with them and hear their wisdom has really been amazing. And to have access to that on a daily basis is pretty lucky. And then there's just one other practice in medical school, and I'm not sure that they do this still, but we had anatomy lab where we worked with a cadaver for, I believe it was only half the year. I think it was 6 months. But to be there with, when I heard of charnel ground practice, I immediately thought back to, and I can still picture the cadaver that I worked with. For a little while I was doing a lot of practice around the body parts. There's like mindfulness of the 32 body parts.
Mm-hmm.
It's guided in pretty good detail about, it's not the 32 nice parts of the body or what we would think are the nice parts of the body. It's all 32.
Have you done the ones where you have to imagine them decaying and all of that stuff?
I have done that practice, and I guess because I'm a physician, I can really divorce. I know the FBI investigators train at some place in like Virginia or south of there, because you can donate your body to this place, because I believe they have enough cadavers, but you can donate your body to be a decomposition.
Oh, I've heard of this. Yes.
So that investigators can understand how the body decomposes, so that they can then investigate crimes to kind of figure out. But I always wondered if they'd let a meditation group sit there and you can really read. I mean, that's probably the closest thing to a charnel ground. These are deep practices. Of course, one has to be very, very secure, very, very safe. But I think my training as a physician, I have all that exposure already. So it really wasn't too much of a challenge to go there.
Well, it raises an interesting, at least a thought that's interesting to me, which is it takes something to be able, as you're saying, to kind of step out of it enough to be able to sort of be in it without taking it in some way that would overwhelm you, your senses or your emotions or something. And then to re-engage with it in a practice and say, okay, now it's me that's dying. It's not just this body, like bodies decay, all bodies decay, but now it's this one that I'm like particularly attached to, literally, whether that it may be harder if you've had that kind of training, I don't know, or as you're saying, maybe easier because you can sort of, okay, yawn, like, bodies decompose, whatever. But when it's this one.
I think already you give me chills when you say, when it's this body, yeah, because I think of, everything I'd be leaving behind. I realize that I'm going to die. I just think it's going to be years or decades in the future.
Right. Yeah.
And I believe that it's going to be in an orderly fashion. So my kids aren't going to die first. But I think the other side to that coin is, so all the more reason to celebrate and enjoy now, because it is so ephemeral. It is so impermanent. So I think about that and I'm like, so yeah, why waste my time on the small stuff, on the nitpicky views and preferences, and enjoy what short time we have left.
It feels especially timely maybe right now, as we've been through and are going through this pandemic. I know it's been a great teacher, just thinking about death and loss and grief and so much that we've all been through over this last year.
Yeah, I think, what I'm feeling a lot of right now is as things are opening up again and interacting with strangers. Yeah, I feel like there's a big collective grief out there that each of us are holding or not holding in some sort of way that we're going to have to work with.
How are things in the nursing home where you are? I'm just curious. I know many have just really been decimated and there's been lots and lots of loss. Yeah.
Decimated is the right word. It's pretty apropos because we had about 8 of 60 patients die from the virus, from coronavirus. So, and almost everybody, this was in November, December, almost everybody ended up testing positive for it, except for 4 or 5 residents. And then about a month after that, the vaccine rollout came. So yeah, it was a tough winter.
Yeah, that is tough. I know how hard it is when you lose a lot of people at once, especially in smaller places like that.
Yeah, because it's a nursing home. I mean, these people live here. This is their home, and you're used to kind of seeing the quirky, quacky, person in that room. And these two are always fighting, but now they don't have a fighting partner.
Of course, the year has been tumultuous. The social and political unrest, the murder of George Floyd. What have you been thinking about? How have you been coping with that stuff?
I've been doing all right. This practice, this really opening awareness, being mindful. I feel things deeper, willing to feel things deeper rather than to kind of shut down and move away. And so it's been a year of very up and down emotions. And I think because of the quarantining and shelter in place orders and the lack of sports and entertainment venues, we Americans haven't had our usual distractors. And I think that allowed for an uplift of the coverage of social injustice that has been going on in this country since its founding. And I remember during the George Floyd murder, I identify as a Black American man. And I remember the coverage. And I do remember thinking, okay, yeah, this has been happening forever. Like, this will be covered. And then, something else will come up in the news. They'll move on to the next news item. But then, a week later or 2 weeks later, I was like, this is still being covered. And I was both glad for that and also saddened, I think, by it. And uncomfortable too, because I had rarely seen kind of the tragedy of a Black man continue to be focused on in the news to a point where we could begin to get underneath the surface. And you started hearing stories in mainstream media about police violence, about the roots of policing in slave patrols. Police departments are set up and designed now is a direct result of how slave patrols were designed and used in the antebellum period. And where I learned that, or where I was exposed to that, was on the nightly news. I didn't have to dig into, this obscure history book. So the fact that this was being talked about in public, it drew up a lot of emotion in me. And what I was thankful for is really the jewel of sangha at that period of time, and really the jewel of Black spaces and BIPOC spaces, so Black, Indigenous people of color. And the fact that on Zoom, I can get together with tens to hundreds of other folks of color and have a safe space to sit, to heal, to resource was also amazing about the coexistence of the pandemic. It's forcing things onto Zoom, as well as George Floyd's murder, as well as the murder of Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin.
And as you're saying, just the sadness of how many other lives have not been given the attention, that equally deserve as much, attention and grief and outrage as what happened with George Floyd.
And it's difficult. I have a hard time with also the unwanted martyrdom. George Floyd did not set out to be a martyr for the cause. He was not Malcolm X. He was not Martin Luther King Jr. He was not John Brown. He was just trying to live an everyday householder's life. He did not give, a speech the day before he died about having been to the mountaintop and, all this prophetic stuff that, Martin Luther King was a realized man. He was ready and he knew that he was going to die for this cause. But to be snuffed out, just living your life, just trying to survive like any of us, it's difficult for me to hold. And in fact, right now, I think the trial for the alleged perpetrators of his murder is occurring now. So I know I will be retreating into sangha, I think, more as this goes on. I really like a lot of there's a number of Buddhist groups that are really into social activism. So kind of getting off the cushion, engaged Buddhism. And I found that to be very helpful. And of course, this is where the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh are absolutely applicable. And it's about being resourced for oneself, and then being able to then take that and be compassionate with others. But then to also realize when you may be exhausted and need to come back into retreat. And I think Thich Nhat Hanh definitely embodied that in terms of his activism. But he also took time to sit silently. And I think at one point he said, he was still in Vietnam, and there was mayhem and injury going on. And I think somebody asked, well, what are you going to do? Are you just going to stay in your monastery, or are you going to help? I think he said, I'm going to do both. We're going to sit and then we're going to go help. And then we're going to sit and then we're going to go help. So
if you could time travel and speak to the Charles Lee Joseph who was about to start meditating, what would you tell him? What do you wish people knew who are not into meditation?
I think the first thing I would say is that just try and sit there or stand there. And don't even worry about whether you're thinking or not. Even if you sit there and plan your next vacation, it's still better than the multitasking that we tend to do, which is I'm going to plan my next vacation while trying to do this, while trying to do that, while trying to, But I'd say, take it easy. Nothing you are doing is wrong. Everything you are doing is part of the quote unquote practice. It's not enjoyable in the conventional sense of joy, in that sometimes, yes, there are some meditation sits that are, if the weather is perfect and there's bird song and you've actually maybe you gave somebody dana and somebody decided to watch your kids for you and you have all this free time. Yes, those sits are absolutely wonderful, but some of the everyday sits are just I'm tired, I'm hungry, I need to use the bathroom. But if you can get curious about those states, you can discover a lot of interesting things about yourself. So, it's obviously not for everybody, but I think you got to try it. You got to try it, and you got to try it for a period of time. It can't just be once or twice or 3 times. I would say try it for a month. If you can even just sit for 5 minutes a day for a month. For me, at least, it's just, I would have said before it's about understanding the human condition, but I think that's me actually, over intellectualizing things. I think it's about being with the human experience or being the human experience. I don't even know that I don't need to understand it. What's so fascinating is just being with it. Because for me, once I let go of trying to, understand and narrate so many parts of my life, there's a whole lot of mental energy left to do awareness practice. It's if I'm not trying to play 8-dimensional chess with my wife.
Right. You've got 5 plot lines going at once.
Yeah.
It's one of those complicated HBO TV shows.
Exactly.
Is there any place, if people would love to hear more from Charles Lee, where they might go to do such a thing?
Yeah, you're talking to a true householder.
Well, perhaps if there's any places that have been, or organizations, communities, groups that have been really meaningful or helpful on your path, is there any you'd like to kind of mention or name here?
Oh, sure. I'd love to. Yeah, I should shout out. Here in Albuquerque, we have a local POC sangha. Yeah, yogapOCsangha.org. So anybody, in the Albuquerque area who identifies as a Black, Indigenous, or person of color that's a wonderful place. There's the Albuquerque Insight Meditation Center, which is our local sangha. They've been wonderful. And certainly UCSD's mindfulness program, because that's how I met Alex. And for Engaged Buddhism, I've gotten great teachings from Paya Zen Center. That's Roshi Joan Halifax's center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Yeah, and then I've just gotten great through Zoom, just fabulous teachers. I'm reading Black and Buddhist. So each of those authors really have been role models for me because of just how, in each of their stories, how they came to the Dharma, came to practice and teaching. I could see myself in that archetype, so I definitely like to lift them up.
Well, this was wonderful, Charles Lee. Thanks
Thank
again
you
so much for your time and your generosity with your thoughts and ideas and insights.
Oh, you're welcome. This has been wonderful for me. There's nothing like being able to talk at length to really help see the edges of practice and, what I seem to be excited about.
So true. Thank you for sharing. So good to talk to you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.